What if one of the most complete sources of protein on the planet is something you've already pulled out of your garden and thrown in a trash bag? Because it stung your hand and you assumed it was just a weed. Not a supplement, not a powder in a tub. Real food, growing in places most people walk straight past without a second look. Stinging nettle. Most people know it for one thing, the sting, and that's exactly why it gets pulled and discarded instead of eaten. But dried and ground into powder, nettle leaf runs somewhere between 26 and 30 grams of protein per 100 grams. For comparison, lean beef sits around 20 to 23 grams of protein per 100 grams of raw meat, and one medium egg gives you roughly 6 to 7 grams. That means a plant most people fight to keep out of their yard is quietly outperforming the animal protein sitting in their fridge. The sting disappears completely the moment it's dried, cooked, or blended into powder, so there's no trick to eating it safely, just gloves for the harvest. And it doesn't need planting at all in most climates. It's already growing along fences, in ditches, in the corner of the yard nobody mows. The protein was never missing from your property. It was just labeled as a nuisance instead of a food. Long before nettle was ever considered a food, another plant was already doing this job across the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Fava beans, sometimes called broad beans, have been cultivated for at least 10,000 years, making them one of the oldest crops humans have ever deliberately grown. Older than written language, older than most civilizations we study in school. Dry fava beans carry around 26 grams of protein per 100 grams, putting them essentially even with lean beef and comfortably ahead of an egg by a factor of 4. They also bring iron, fiber, and folate along with that protein, which is exactly why they became a staple crop across an entire region for thousands of years instead of a passing trend. This wasn't a health food discovery. It was survival math that happened to work extremely well. Sweet lupin beans push the number even higher. Depending on variety, dry lupin seed runs between 31 and 36 grams of protein per 100 grams, which puts it ahead of most cuts of beef entirely, not just tied with them. That number sits in the same range people usually associate with soybeans, except lupin has been cultivated across the Mediterranean and parts of South America for centuries, long before soy protein isolate ever became a product on a shelf. Lupin also grows in poor, sandy soil where many other legumes struggle, which is part of why it survived as a regional staple instead of disappearing the moment more glamorous crops became available. It never needed rich farmland to earn its place at the table. Mung beans are the one plant on this list many people already own without realizing what they're holding. Dry mung beans carry close to 24 grams of protein per 100 grams, again landing right in beef territory. They've been a staple across South and East Asia for thousands of years, used in everything from soups to sprouted salads, precisely because they cook fast and deliver serious protein without needing refrigeration, slaughter, or a supply chain. The only real gap is in two specific amino acids, methionine and cysteine, which is easily closed by pairing mung beans with a grain like rice in the same meal, a combination that's been used instinctively for centuries, long before anyone had a word for amino acid complementation: moringa. A tree native to the foothills of the Himalayas, cultivated for centuries across Asia and Africa long before anyone called it a superfood. Its leaves, dried and ground into powder, carry between 25 and 30 grams of protein per 100 grams, putting it comfortably in beef territory and far ahead of an egg. What makes moringa unusual is how little it asks for in return. The tree tolerates drought, poor soil, and repeated harvesting, regrowing its leaves within weeks after cutting, which is exactly why it became a staple in regions where reliable rainfall was never guaranteed. Communities across parts of Africa and South Asia have relied on it for generations, not as a trend, but as one of the few crops that kept producing food when almost nothing else would. Every part of the tree gets used too: seeds, pods, even the roots. So one plant growing in a backyard corner can quietly cover far more of a family's nutrition than its size would suggest. In some regions, a single tree provides enough dried leaf powder to supplement an entire household's diet through months when other vegetables are scarce. Lentils. Long before anyone tracked macros, lentils were already feeding entire regions across the Near East, among the very first crops humans ever deliberately cultivated. Dry lentils carry roughly 24 to 26 grams of protein per 100 grams, again landing right beside lean beef. They store for years without refrigeration, cook down in 20 minutes, and cost a fraction of meat per serving, which is exactly why they outlasted empires while staying a kitchen staple the entire time. Nobody needed convincing that lentils worked. They simply never stopped being useful. Generation after generation, long after flashier crops came and went. And like mung beans, pairing them with a grain rounds out the amino acid profile completely. A combination nearly every lentil-eating culture landed on independently, long before anyone understood why it worked so well. That reliability is also why lentils show up in the earliest known farming settlements ever excavated, sitting in storage pits alongside the very first grains humans learned to save. Put those two side by side with everything already covered, and a pattern starts to show up. None of these plants needed a lab, a marketing budget, or a cold chain to prove themselves. They needed dirt, water when available, and enough time to grow, which is exactly the kind of protein source that keeps working when supply chains don't. Deep in the Amazon, a star-shaped seed pod holds something that looks nothing like a typical protein source: Sacha Inchi. The seeds run between 25 and 27 grams of protein per 100 grams, landing squarely alongside lean beef. But they carry something beef never will: a fat profile loaded with omega-3s, at levels that rival fish oil. Indigenous communities in the Peruvian Amazon have eaten these seeds for generations, roasted like nuts or pressed for oil, long before anyone outside the region had ever heard the name. It never needed a marketing campaign to be a complete food. It just needed people who already lived where it grew. The last one didn't come from a rainforest or a desert overseas. It grew in the woods and along riverbanks across the eastern half of what's now the United States, long before European settlers ever arrived. Apios americana, sometimes called the American groundnut or potato bean. Its tubers run between roughly 11 and 20% protein by dry weight, close to 3 times what a potato offers, and Native American communities relied on it as a staple root crop for generations, digging it from riverbanks the same way other cultures relied on potatoes or cassava. It's a perennial vine, meaning once it's established, it comes back on its own year after year, with no replanting required. Somewhere along the way, as commercial agriculture standardized around a handful of crops, this one simply got left behind, not because it stopped working, but because nobody was selling it. Here's the part worth sitting with. None of this is really an argument that meat is bad, or that everyone needs to give it up. Protein is protein. A muscle fiber rebuilding itself doesn't know or care whether the amino acids came from a cow, an egg, a fence line weed, or a root pulled from a river bank. It only cares that the nutrients showed up. What makes these 8 plants worth knowing isn't that they win some argument on the internet. It's that they solve the protein problem in places where raising animals is slow, expensive, or simply impossible. Nettle does it on land nobody bothered to plant. Fava and lupin do it on soil too poor for more demanding crops. Moringa does it in a backyard with almost no water to spare. Lentils have done it for thousands of years in a bowl that costs almost nothing. Mung beans do it in a bowl that costs pennies and needs no refrigeration. Sacha Inchi does it in a rainforest canopy most farmland could never replicate. And Apios does it quietly, year after year, without ever being replanted. Raising cattle still works. It's just slow, expensive, and starts from zero every single cycle: feed, water, years of growth, then slaughter, then refrigeration. A lot of these plants, once established, just keep coming back on their own, from a root, from dropped seed, from a fence line nobody's touched in years. So instead of asking whether meat is good or bad, the more useful question might be simpler. What's already growing near you right now that you've been walking past without ever once considering it food? So tell me, do you have nettle or something like it growing somewhere on your own property right now that you've always pulled and thrown away? And if you've ever eaten fava beans, lupin, or apios, what did you make with them? Drop it in the comments.